So as more and more of the evolutionary story conflicted with the early chapters of Genesis, many theologians now claim that the entire first part of the book of Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, are purely poetry and are not meant to be taken seriously. Why Genesis 1 through 11? Well, because the creation and genealogies go against evolution, the flood goes against millions of years, and even the Tower of Babel contradicts the evolutionary idea that man came from Africa. So is there any validity to the claim that the early chapters of Genesis are poetry? Could we have been wrong in our interpretation of the book the whole time? Well, to figure this out, we need to understand a bit more of Hebrew, and bear with me. In the Hebrew language, there is a letter that we call vav. Remember vav from the gap theory? Whenever this letter modifies a verb, it indicates that the sentence is part of a sequential narrative, that each action follows the one before it. So when you have the verb, veomer, and he said, that's an action, and he said, and he did this, and he did this. Repeated vav consecutives indicate narrative. Because of this, a Hebrew text where a vav consecutive is used frequently, it is meant to be taken as historical. Strikingly, the vav consecutive appears a total of 55 times from Genesis 1:1 to Genesis 2:3. That's more narrative indicators than there are verses. Furthermore, Genesis chapter 12 begins with a vav consecutive, which means that the events in chapter 12 directly follow from the events prior. This means that there's no reason from the text itself to divide Genesis 1 through 11 from the rest of the book. It all flows as a complete narrative. Genesis is also structured on the recurring phrase Ele Toledoth, which literally means this is the book of the genealogy of, or this is the history of. Genesis 1 through 11 is structured on a Hebrew phrase that literally means this is history. It appears 6 times in Genesis 1 through 11 and 5 times in the rest of the book, meaning God through Moses intended all of it to be taken naturally, not as allegory or metaphor. Speaking of Moses, who wrote the book of Genesis, God actually describes how they communicate with each other. God said, "Hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" So if God speaks so straightforwardly to Moses, why should we believe Genesis to be any less straightforward when Moses wrote Genesis? Another thing we need to do is interpret Scripture with Scripture. How does the rest of the Bible treat Genesis 1 through 11? We find that in the Old Testament, 1 Chronicles records a genealogy that goes all the way back to Adam. Psalm 29 and 104 mention the global flood. Isaiah 54 speaks of the covenant after the flood, and in Ezekiel, God refers to Noah. The New Testament has even more examples. Jesus referenced the creation of man and woman in Matthew and Mark. Paul talked about Adam and Eve and the fall in Romans 1 and 2 Corinthians and even 1 Timothy. Jesus mentions Abel in Luke 11, and the book of Luke begins with a genealogy that goes back to Adam and contains names found in the Genesis genealogies. Jude mentions Cain in verse 11 and Enoch in verse 14. Jesus talked about the flood in Matthew 24 and compares it to his second coming in Luke 17. Peter also talks about the flood, compares it to the future fiery judgment. There's no hint of Genesis being poetry, allegory, or metaphor anywhere in the Bible. Now, Genesis is not just history. It also teaches theology, among other things, but it is not less than history. But let's say I give it to you. Sure, Genesis can be poetry. That does not suddenly mean that it can mean whatever you want. I've talked with people, including pastors, that have told me that Genesis is poetry, which somehow means it can be interpreted any way you like. But this isn't logical, because poetry still has meaning, and it can still convey history. Take Psalm 78, for example. He divided the sea and let them pass through it, and made the waters stand like a heap. In the daytime he led them with a cloud, and all the night with a fiery light. He split rocks in the wilderness and gave them drink abundantly as from the deep. He made streams come out of the rock and caused waters to flow down like rivers. Pretty straightforward. He's talking about the Israelites and the Exodus, but it's poetry, so it must mean that God used evolution to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. See, even if Genesis were poetry, it would still mean exactly what it says.